basically it was like a place for like men that go to gamble and that, and one night they were there having a couple of drinks, playing a game of cards.
After one night during the game of cards, someone knocked at the door.
And they went to see it, and it was someone they've never seen before. But they let him in anyway because he just was asking for a drink and said he'd join in the game of cards.
There was this man, mysterious sort of strange man, and he asked could he come in and join them. And they were like, yeah, sure. And they invited him in. They were all drinking away. And, a lot of drinking and drugs and mind-altering substances being taken.
And when they were playing, one of them dropped a card, and when he went down, bent down to pick it up, he saw that the stranger had hooves. All of a sudden he burst into flames and went flying out the roof, and basically then they all just left the Hellfire Club, and it's just gone to ruin since.
And so then when they found this out, they all fled and they all ran away and left, and they never returned. That's the story I know.
It's nice, isn't it?
380 metres up into the Dublin Mountains, nearly 20 kilometres away from the city centre, the main road breaks off to the right and into an area of Dublin known as Mass's Estate. 100 metres up the road, a path winds its way through the forest to Montpellier Hill, the summit of which is a wide open clearing with a mysterious building known as the Hellfire Club at its centre. The area is a popular spot for hill walkers, cyclists and camping enthusiasts alike, with the Wicklow Way leading up and over Montpellier Hill and over to the Sally Gap. However, many believe the top of Montpellier Hill to be haunted. But what is the provenance of this building? How did it become to be known as the Hellfire Club? And where does the folklore originate
Back in
from?
1724, William Connolly, who was probably one of Ireland's richest men at the time, bought Rathfarnham Castle and all the lands around, and those lands stretch right up to Montpellier Hill. And I would say that he was probably riding the bounds of the new land he'd bought with friends when he came across this wonderful hill, grassy hill, that wasn't boggy because the boglands were behind and to the south. And this tremendous view right down over Dublin City, Dublin Bay, and off to the Mourne Mountains. And in fact, when the weather is clear, you can see Wales. And he must have said, this would be the place to have a hunting lodge. So, and also, because there happened to be a Neolithic cairn on the hill as well, a ready-made quarry for stone to build his big stone, and an elaborate hunting lodge. The hunting lodge is built in the Palladian style, and that's why I consider it's architect designed. Edward Lovett Pearce took up the design of Castletown House, and it is the greatest Palladian building in Ireland. The Hellfire Club is typical Palladian in that it's very symmetrical, and as I say, if you look at it now, it looks like a rough heap of old stones, but you have to look beyond that and think about it when it was plastered fully, when the windows are in, the doors are in, the cut stone steps were built up to the front door. It had a relatively short life because it was built in 1725, and by 1750 it was abandoned. The avenue comes up a long winding way from the west. It would have come right around to the front. There would have been an area in the front that would have been set aside, probably gravelled, where the arrivals would arrive, both the carriages would arrive and the horses would arrive. And then there would be a very fine staircase up to the front door, and the front door would have been rather finely organised with a fan light. You can see that there's a fan light there, fan light over. When you walk into the building, you would have had niches on each side, and then you were into the hall, and then the reception rooms were on either side. I think it would have been probably whitewashed, stuccoed and whitewashed. It may have had a thatched roof, it's hard to say. It may have had a thatched roof if there was thatching material to be had. Otherwise they would have lugged up slates. Kind of unlikely that they would have gone to the trouble of lugging up slates. All the stone that it's built off comes from the area, so it would have been handy. It had two main rooms, one being a dining room, one being a living room or games room. But above one of the rooms was the bedroom, and there was a timber stairs up to that, and the doorway, you can still see the doorway there at a higher level up above the concrete stairs that was put in by the Board of Works. So while it would have been fairly close, you would have been in fairly close contact. You must remember these guys were there for a bit of drinking and shouting and playing cards and going off and hunting. It was a real boy's job, a real lad's job, and that's what they did.
William Connolly's death saw the hunting lodge on top of Montpellier Hill take a turn from riches to ruin as it was left to crumble. Little is known about the activities of those close to Connolly following his death, although it is said that the insides were gutted and the furniture moved elsewhere. But what about the Hellfire Club name? Is it possible that members of the Hellfire Club took over the building following Connolly's death?
I first got interested in the subject about 8 years ago, and initially I just wanted to find something good to read on it, and I thought actually it would be a good subject for a documentary initially, but I couldn't find anything decent. And luckily, because of the paintings in the National Gallery were the names of most of the members of the Dublin Hellfire Club and the Limerick Hellfire Club as well, so you could kind of go on that as a starting point, find out a bit about these guys and then try and find out a bit more about the society they operated in. There are interesting stories told about it from even in 1798. You've the United Irishmen and the 1798 rebellion. One of the United Irishmen, Joseph Holt, and you've probably seen this in my book. I allude to it. But he was fleeing from Crown forces during the suppression of the rebellion, and he says in his memoirs, I went across the fields towards Montpellier, that enchanted house. And I was so fatigued that the name of enchantment could not deter me. And in God's name I said my prayers and I slept soundly. That shows, because he called it the Enchanted House, that it already had a reputation at that time. And there's also reference to it in another source a couple of years later as the Haunted House. So it was known as a place to be avoided, or a place that had certain sinister properties, even in the late 18th century.
Joseph Holt was obviously aware of the stories when he stayed the night in the Hellfire Club on Montpellier Hill. But is there any truth to these stories? Where did their origins come from? Did the devil really appear on top of Montpellier Hill?
Those stories were told a lot to kind of dissuade ordinary people, or the peasantry, if we can use that term, from gambling. In other words, if you thought that the devil was going to turn up when you were playing cards, it might kind of be a disincentive for you to blow all your money gambling. And they would have been put about maybe by priests or moralists, people with a moral agenda, to kind of dissuade the country people from actually, getting up to the same kind of activity that the Hellfire Club were getting up to. The most notorious members of the Hellfire Club, well, we've just spoken about Lord Santry. To give you a little more detail on his background, he was a relatively young nobleman. He was about 27, 28 years old when the Hellfire Club was active. His father had died a few years previously. His father was an alcoholic who drank himself to death, more or less. And Lord Santry in his early 20s had succeeded to the title of 4th Baron Barry of Santry, and to the family estates, which were quite extensive in counties Dublin, Kildare and Meath. And he seems to have taken this then as a licence to just go on an unbridled career of self-indulgence. And the situation was not helped by the fact that his mother was a very indulgent woman who kind of doted on him and wouldn't hear a bad word said against him. So much so that when Jonathan Swift, who was outraged by Lord Santry's activities, tried to speak to his mother to try and get her to rein him in somewhat, she completely rebuffed him and I suppose told him to mind his own business. A contemporary account written a few years after Lord Santry died tells us that this particular servant was lying ill in bed, And Lord Santry came in, forced him to drink a full bottle of brandy, and then he poured another bottle of spirits all over the bed sheets and set the whole thing alight. So moving on from him to profiling other members of the club, there's the club's president, supposed president, the first Earl of Ross, Richard Parsons. He doesn't actually appear in the club portrait, but he is referenced in a contemporary source as being the co-founder of the club with the English artist James Worsdale. He was an ex-member of the Freemasons, in fact an ex-Grand Master of the Freemasons, and he was also a bit of a man about town, a well-known libertine. And apart from that, he was noted for his generosity. There are references to him being, giving money to the poor and standing people drinks in taverns and that kind of thing. And so from that point of view, he comes across as, and there are no references to him committing any murders or atrocities of the kind that Lord Santry was notorious for. These days, the Hellfire Club are often remembered as a group of devil worshippers. Peter Lenz is probably the only member of the club that at the time we can definitely connect with devil worship, activity that could be described as devil worship. A report at the House of Lords, which was a committee of the House of Lords which was put together to inquire into the Blasters stroke Hellfire Club's activities, said about Peter Lenz that he had publicly drank the devil's health and offered up prayers to him and proclaimed himself to be a votary of the devil. Now this appears to the outside observer as outright worship of the powers of darkness, Now, as mentioned, Peter Lenz probably didn't really believe in the devil. He was probably just doing this to provoke people. But to outsiders or people who heard this, it certainly seemed like he was a devil worshipper, and that conduct was notorious enough to bring him to the attention of the House of Lords, and to get a proclamation issued against him. But what I found was quite interesting when I was doing the research was the kind of circumstantial evidence which would link the Hellfire Club of 1738 to that building. When I was researching in UCD's Department of Irish Folklore, I came across an account of a murder perpetrated up in Montpellier. They put the butler into the fire and burned him, and after that happened, the butler's widow instituted proceedings against those who had committed the crime. Now that's very strongly reminiscent of the murders committed by Lord Santry. It's Lord Santry who burned a servant alive, and Lord Santry who also stabbed another servant to death, and then that servant's widow issued proceedings against him. So it would indicate to me that 200 years later, in the 1930s, actual incidents, factual incidents connected with the Hellfire Club were being talked about in connection with Montpellier.
Although there is no physical evidence to suggest that anyone was ever thrown into a fireplace in the Hellfire Club, the brooding ruin overlooking Dublin Bay and City still sparks the imaginations of all those who live around it, both children and adults alike.